Concerto No. 3 in B minor, Opus 61, was written by Camille Saint-Saens in March of 1880. The lyricism of this piece can be attributed to Saint-Saens' pursuit in composing operas, as his first full-length opera, The Silver Bell, debuted just 3 years prior to the composition of this concerto. The piece was written 5 years after the marriage of Camille Saint-Saens, and 1 year before he left his wife. It is speculated that the emotional turbulence he experienced during the brief marriage contributes to the 2 recurring motives of the first movement: the elated romantic theme, marked dolce tranquillo, and the powerful declamatory theme, marked forte appassionato with accents. In 1878, Saint-Saens and his wife Marie Laure Truffaut experienced the deaths of both of their sons within a 6-week period. One fell from a window, and the other died of pneumonia. 40-something-year-old Saint-Saens and his 20-year-old wife continued to live together for 3 years, but Saint-Saens blamed his wife for the death of their children, and he resentfully left her. The violin concerto in B minor was specifically written for a friend of Saint-Saens, Pablo de Sarasate. Sarasate is known for his great technical skill as a violinist. This knowledge helps to give the performer some context as to how to play the more difficult passages of the piece. Sarasate's fiery style as a soloist has helped inspire many violinists in their pursuit of the Saint-Saens violin concerto. This particular piece is challenging on every level. Quote, "The piece must be performed with readiness and urgency that preserves the essential good manners of the occasion." End quote. Audiences enjoyed the gripping contrast between the 2 main themes of the first movement. Reviews of the piece vary according to the soloist who performed, but the overall reception of the movement was favorable. One critic wrote, quote, "The orchestral strings employ a nice range of vibrato, responding admirably to the varied demands of the music, while the soloist invests the subtleties of his part with a brooding melancholy and declamatory power that are wholly appropriate." Critics of his day accused Saint-Saens of being too conservative. Other French composers like Claude Debussy were interested in impressionism. Saint-Saens wasn't. People thought that Saint-Saens should have been more exploratory in his compositions. However, the consonance of his pieces stands out among the more dissonant pieces composed by those around him during his day. Saint-Saens' principles of composition sprouted from his French roots, and he stuck to the traditions that he was taught from his youth, both in the structure of his pieces and in the melodic purity that he is known for. It has been said of Saint-Saens that he creates instantly memorable melodies. The piece begins in B minor, with the commanding egotistical melody immediately grabbing the attention of the audience. Saint-Saens uses just 5 notes to completely captivate the listener. This iconic A theme occurs many times throughout the piece, and every time it occurs there is a slight difference in the way it is portrayed. Although the key in which it occurs differs throughout the movement, every repetition of this theme is played on the G string, the deepest and most gruff-sounding string of the violin. The G string has a rich, raw sound to it that demands power and poise. This type of playing requires quite a bit of confidence from the soloist. Following the first occurrence of the theme, the piece is compelled forward by a technically challenging B section, comprised of double stops, arpeggios, runs, trills, and plenty of shifts. This section is sometimes viewed as a segue between one main theme to another, but it is actually a vital portion of the piece. It is so much more than just a development. It contains a lot of intense technical details that take focus, concentration, and artistry. It combines elements of the expressive motive and the more intense angry motive of the piece. Saint-Saens wasted no time in diving into the massive challenge of this concerto. This section successfully captivates the listener and leads to the lyrical, responsive theme of the movement. This lyrical theme, section C, first occurs at measure 82, after a brief orchestral interlude. This section is still in B minor. The entrance of the soloist introduces an enchanting new character to the piece, incorporating the same intervals that represent the iconic 5-note theme introduced in the A section, this time using eighth notes instead of quarter notes. Marked espressivo, this passage is played with a light sound, using many slides to exaggerate the romance. This new idea provides a stark contrast from the original bold opening. It is also marked tranquillo assai, or very tranquil. This portion of the piece is sweet and uninhibited. The artist is free to express themselves, and even encouraged to be relaxed with the pulse. The first key change of the piece occurs in measure 98, at which time it changes to E major. The key change itself is smooth, beautiful, and captivating. It's difficult to tell that the key is changed at all. This D section is marked dolce e espressivo, and is even more romantic and beautiful than the character preceding it. This passage is striking because it is so different from every other section in the piece. Both times this theme occurs, it ends with a dissonant, ethereal scale, marked diminuendo collando meaning dying away and reducing speed. Saint-Saens wanted this dynamic to stand out so much that he wrote it in another way. He included the word perdendosi, which also means to die away. An orchestral interlude takes us back to the 5-note theme of the piece that we heard in the beginning. This time it is in E major. Following this theme is one of the most challenging parts of the piece, section E. The passage builds in both dynamic level and difficulty until a pivotal and climatic point, at which the soloist plays a scale of broken octave 16th notes. Saint-Saens then reverts back to the beautiful cantabile espressivo section we heard earlier. This time it's not only in a different key, E major, it's also in a completely different register of the instrument, played up high on the E string where the violin can truly glow in sound. Note that the 5-note iconic theme is used here once again, written with 8th notes instead of quarter notes. It's interesting that he uses this rhythm specifically in the cantabile passages to provide a contrast from the deep sound of the G string. This section is followed by a key change into B major that brings us to a recapitulation of the most dolce part of the piece. After this dolce espressivo section is restated, the soloist dies away with another dissonant, ethereal scale. The orchestra then begins a build-up that brings us back into B minor, and for the final time, we hear the iconic 5-note theme of the piece. By this time, the audience has heard so many challenging runs and double stops that they've come to expect it. Saint-Saens surprises everyone by including an intense passage of 8th notes climbing up the fingerboard. The solo part continues to increase in volume and intensity throughout this section, until we reach the most technically difficult part of the piece, an 11-bar build-up of broken arpeggio 16th note string crosses that stretch both the hand and the skill of the violinist. Although not expressly marked, this section is considered to be the cadenza of the movement. Saint-Saens finishes the first movement just as he began it, very powerfully. Fortissimo arpeggios lead to a high B2, and each orchestral instrument lands on a solid B, ending the piece in the bold key of B minor. The audience is left wanting more, waiting in stunned silence for something grand to happen. Accompaniment. From the very first moment of the piece, Saint-Saens captivates his audience by using tremolo to paint a picture of mystery. String instruments and timbales set a misty scene. There's an element of uncertainty and wonder in this opening that keeps the listener on the edge of his seat and piques his curiosity. An interesting characteristic of this movement is that the accompaniment is pretty limited. The piece is obviously centered around the soloist, and the accompaniment only enhances, it never distracts. The solo violin part is very virtuosic and expressive, but each time the soloist plays a run or a difficult, faster-moving passage, the accompaniment either plays sustained, longer notes, or else it drops out completely. The first instance we see of this occurs close to the start of the piece, at bar 62. Although the entire score cannot be shown, it is sufficient to say that during these soloistically difficult passages, which occur frequently, accompaniment is very basic and simple if it occurs at all. String instruments are used more than winds or brass. There are some instances of call and response within this movement. One example of this occurs at measure 28, where the violin makes a powerful declaration. The strings respond with the same notes, equally as forceful and declamatory. Because this piece is structured around the soloist, there are a few instances when the soloist has to change the character of the piece entirely on their own. One example of this occurs at bar 82, just before the cantabile B section. The orchestra plays a forte, assertive interlude, and the soloist must transition to a mezzo forte, expressive character within the space of one beat. There is no diminuendo during this transition, and it's up to the soloist to introduce this vital new motive. Another interesting method used by Saint-Saens is the transfer of melodies from higher voices to lower voices. An example of this occurs at bar 225, when 4 sweet melodic notes are passed from the first violins through the different string sections all the way down to the bass players. One additional tactic Saint-Saens uses to captivate the audience and maintain balance is the idea of role reversal. While the orchestra holds sustained notes during the soloist's runs, he provides the orchestra with a bit more action during the brief moments when the violinist isn't playing something technically inspiring. It's obvious from this excerpt that Saint-Saens was concerned about the sound of the violin getting lost in the grandeur of the orchestra. However, his traditional methods of composition eliminated this concern in the way he organized the accompaniment. The first movement of the Saint-Saens Violin Concerto in B minor is a musical masterpiece that will stand the test of time. The piece uses 2 independent, contrasting motives to demonstrate every angle of the violin, both expressively and technically. Not only is the piece challenging for the soloist, but it is also artful in the accompaniment part, whether played by an orchestra or by a pianist. The piece is truly a work of art that displays such ingenuity in the composer. It is one of Saint-Saens' most renowned and appreciated works.